how do we understand the goal of Buddhist practice? One way I would submit to understand that goal is that the goal is one of coming to equanimity with our own mortality. Now, the goal of many religions is a goal of confronting our mortality in one way or another. That is to say, religions and early philosophical ideas. And one of the ways that many religions confront our mortality is to suggest that we have open to us perhaps a form of immortality, a form of eternal life that will go on after our deaths. While Buddhism confronts mortality, it does so in a very different way. The Buddha himself framed what he called the noble search as one of overcoming mortality. The Buddha describes how, when he was younger, he looked towards things that were open to decay and corruption. Things like pleasure, like fame, like wealth, and so on. These are all ends that are changeable, that disappear, that are liable to pass away. And so, the Buddha notes when he looked back on that time period, then it occurred to me, why don't I seek that which is free of birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and corruption, the supreme sanctuary from the yoke, extinguishment? This search was very much in line with other seers of his day, the Buddha's day, Brahminic seers, who looked to a union of the self, or Atman, with the universal principle, or Brahman, this kind of union that might provide us with some sense of eternal life. This is one of the arguments that scholar Alex Wynne makes in his book, The Origins of Buddhist Meditation, that the Buddha's first meditation teachers indeed came out of just such a Brahminic, or what's known as Upanishadic, milieu. That was their aim in their practice. When the Buddha-to-be first left home, the first people he looked to were meditation teachers of his day. These were Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. The first person he went to was Alara Kalama. Both of these teachers taught what are known as the formless attainments. Different formless attainments. And these must have appeared to the Buddha-to-be, the Bodhisatta, as important because they would bring him close to this kind of extinction, these deep states of meditative absorption would bring him close to the edge of death, we might say. Alara Kalama, this first teacher, taught meditation on what's known as the sphere of nothingness. This involves immersing the mind in a perception of nothingness. The translator Bhikkhu Sujato likens this to a passage in the Chandogya Upanishad where Uddalaka Aruni talks to his son Shvetaketu and tells his son to cut up a banyan fruit. Within the banyan fruit there are seeds. He tells his son to cut up a seed and asks him what he sees inside of that seed, and Shvetaketu says that he sees nothing. And yet it's due to this very nothing that this whole banyan tree, this enormous tree, stands here. Uddalaka says, the finest essence here, that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth. That is the self, or the Atman. So this meditation on nothingness seems to bring us to this perception of this world self, this self that underlies all things, and thereby potentially to a form of eternal life. However, of course, the Buddha-to-be found this meditation wanting. He did not believe that it led where he wanted to go. He believed that it led to rebirth in a temporary sense only. So the Buddha-to-be moved on. He moved to the next teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta. And Uddaka taught a form of meditation so deep that it stood on the knife edge of being a perception at all. It's known as the state of neither perception nor non-perception. This idea of such a state reflects, at least in Sujato's ideas and Alex Wynne's ideas, some ideas that may go back to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, a very early Upanishad, ideas again of the Brahminic seers of the day. Again, I think the point here is to get close to a complete cessation of the mind and mental activity, and so be able to touch death itself and so overcome it in a sense. Get to see this ground of being that lies underneath both life and death. But once again, the Buddha-to-be found this kind of meditation wanting. He didn't believe that it led to true freedom, to this kind of true overcoming of death, but simply to rebirth in another temporary state of being. That's what he saw in it, and that's why he left it behind. In the place of what are known as these formless attainments that were taught by these two teachers, the Buddha preferred what are known as the meditations of the 4 jhanas. This is a series of 4 ever-deepening states which bring us to a kind of equanimity. Now, I'm not going to go into all 4 jhanas here. They're traditionally understood to be somewhat less deep than the formless attainments. However, they also can be analogized to bringing us to a kind of a confrontation with death. This process of the jhanas begins in pleasure, a kind of an agitated pleasure, but as the process continues, we slowly give up that agitation, we slowly give up that pleasure, until we end up in the 4th jhana, the final jhana, in a state that's beyond, it said, beyond pleasure and pain, beyond happiness and sadness, in a state of mindful equanimity, pure mindful equanimity. And this final state is given an analogy in one text where it says, "It's like someone sitting wrapped from head to foot with white cloth. There's no part of the body that's not spread over with white cloth. In the same way, they sit spreading their body through with purified mind. There's no part of the body that's not spread with purified mind." Now we can think of this analogy in several ways. First of all, this white light that filters through the cloth may be analogized to the sort of radiant mind that's spoken of in a number of early texts. On the other hand, this analogy also, I think, suggests death, because in ancient India it was the practice to wrap the departed, that is to say, the corpses, with white cloth before they were cremated. And so therefore this may suggest to us the form of a dead body, basically, that one has encountered death and is within death at the time of this 4th jhana. Further, each of these jhanas is said to have a quote-unquote thorn. That is something that makes it difficult to achieve that jhana, that we have to overcome in order to be in that jhana. And the thorn to the 4th jhana is breathing itself. That is to say, it's suggested traditionally that in order to be in the 4th jhana, one has to cease breathing. Breathing, of course, is the fount of life. Without breath, we are dead. I mean, that is something that was understood in the ancient world as well as today. Now, of course, literally speaking, I don't believe we can overcome breathing, although some traditionalists seem to claim that we can. Probably it's meant simply to mean that breaths become so shallow that they become indistinguishable. Nevertheless, this idea of overcoming breathing, of ceasing to breathe, as well as being wrapped in this white cloth, both suggest ways that the 4th jhana may familiarize ourselves with death. Further, the deepest state of meditative absorption besides nirvana itself in the early tradition is known as the cessation of perception and feeling. And this state is directly analogized to death. It is claimed to be a state that is essentially identical to death, with the exception that the life functions continue in the body and the body remains warm. That is, it involves a complete cessation of all mental operations. In one early sutta, it said that a certain bhikkhu Sanjiva entered the cessation of perception and feeling and was there for long enough that the local townsfolk took him to be dead and tried to cremate his body, and it's said that his body miraculously was not able to be burned, because he was not dead. He was in this very refined state of meditative absorption. So what I've been discussing so far are various states of deep meditation that we find in the early tradition, all of which I think can be analogized in one way or another to death, to dying, to confronting death, to confronting the cessation of mental operations, to confronting one or another aspect of our own mortality. However, even practices, meditations that are closer to our, we might say, ordinary state of mind can also be focused on death and mortality within the early tradition, and indeed are. Now, to begin with, one of the key aspects of mindfulness practice is an ongoing awareness of change, of things coming to be and passing away. And these, of course, are part and parcel of an awareness of death, because death is the ultimate passing away. So we can say that death is within ordinary mindfulness practice, ordinary practices of insight meditation, vipassana, what it's known as. However, in more specific, within the first foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of the body, there are a series of very important meditative practices that are often overlooked nowadays, which are known as the charnel ground contemplations, where the monastic usually, but the practitioner is asked to either literally or at least figuratively sit themselves down in a charnel ground. This is a place in ancient India, around the world, where dead bodies were left outside to rot, to become nothing eventually. And it is suggested that we sit ourselves down and contemplate these bodies in front of us in various states of decay, up to and including the point at which the bones disintegrate into dust. And it's said, in each case, the practitioner would compare that body with their own body. This body is also of that same nature, that same kind, and cannot go beyond that. That is, in this practice, we are supposed to contemplate our bodies as liable to death and decay. In fact, that will certainly die and decay. Now, there's a well-known psychological technique known as exposure therapy, where we expose ourselves to something that we fear, something that we have trouble with. In the American Psychological Association, there is a passage I will read that suggests, in this form of therapy, psychologists create a safe environment in which to expose individuals to the things they fear and avoid. The exposure to the feared objects, activities, or situations in a safe environment helps reduce fear and decrease avoidance. Helps to reduce fear and decrease avoidance. So while we can't safely and easily literally expose ourselves to death in this life, nevertheless, perhaps through such meditative practices as the ones that I've been discussing from early Buddhism, we can be exposed indirectly. And perhaps indeed that's the very point of such practices, to be a kind of exposure therapy. Now, the final goal of Buddhist practice is the attainment of Nirvana, which is known as the deathless, or the freedom from death. Key to achievement of Nirvana involves overcoming our ordinary desire to be reborn, our ordinary desire to continue to live in a future life, which goes hand in hand with this fear that we have, this aversion we have to dying. Upon achieving Nirvana, the Buddha said, "Knowing and seeing like this, my mind was freed from the defilements of sense desire, desire to be reborn, and ignorance." This fear of death that we have, this fear of cessation, is what keeps us attached, at least in a traditional understanding, to the beginningless round of rebirths. However, setting aside the speculative question as to whether there is, in fact, rebirth and whether we've had a beginningless number of lifetimes in the past, nevertheless, we can know directly that it's our fear of death that keeps us wishing for rebirth. To end these rebirths, therefore, means literally to become equanimous with death, equanimous with our own mortality. So the upshot here is that one, I think, a deep understanding of the aim and point of Buddhist practice, and indeed all of these practices, in particular of meditation and deep meditative absorption, is to expose us to states of mind, to states of the world that resemble death in various respects, that bring us close to what death might really be like. And in so doing, to reduce our fear of death, to reduce our avoidance of death, and in so doing, to make us more equanimous and accepting of our own mortality and the death that we can see in front of us. To return to the point that I made at the outset of this video, the goal of much religious and philosophical practice in the past has been to bring us to an overcoming of death through the search for some form of literal immortality, perhaps in a state of enormous bliss, like some heavenly realm. However, the goal in Buddhism, particularly early Buddhism, is quite different. The goal in early Buddhism is to overcome death by making us familiar with states of cessation, with states of death, or that are similar to those in death. States of meditative absorption that involve a cessation of mental activities in one way or another, that involve deep states of equanimity in one way or another, and states of mindfulness that bring us to awareness of the role that change, decay, and death plays in the world. All of these practices are tailored to help us overcome our fear and our avoidance of death, and so become equanimous with our own mortality. If you want to learn more about what Nirvana really is in early Buddhism and Buddhism in general, I did a past video about that, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked right up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.